So Martin Stig Andersen. We have only very briefly a short time. Maybe you could explain how your background led you to doing what you do now, sound design for games, basically.
Yeah, I think my background is originally in instrumental music. So I started instrumental composition at conservatory in Denmark, and then I got more interested in working with electronic media, like in electroacoustic composition. And then by some incident I got introduced to this whole kind of culture of electroacoustic composition. It's its roots in Paris with Pierre Seffer and Irkam and all that, and then I went to study at the City University in London with Dennis Smalley, and then somehow I got involved in audiovisual projects, working more and more with sound design as well. And in some way I consider my sound design very much as music. So it became very much something about not thinking in terms of having an orchestra soundtrack in a kind of a non-diegetic space, but more about how can you use the kind of environment of the film, of the game, in order to build up sound and have kind of musical functions in a way. So I got kind of interesting in going from this very realistic sound world to abstraction, but in a more like a gradual movement, and then not thinking music and sound design as two opposite things, but more like a continuum.
You mentioned Edgar Varese, who got annoyed being accused of not composing music, so he called it organized sound. Which aspects of sound do you organize in your audio creations for games, specifically for Limbo and for what's the latest?
Inside. Yeah.
I mean, you don't compose in traditional themes anymore, like motifs and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So what aspect do you focus on?
Yeah, it's kind of a good question, because as you say, it's not really an organization anymore, because it kind of everything depends on how the game is being played. So I think more of it as a meta organization. So I organize how the game organizes the sound according to what the player does. But it's true that I no longer compose or work in linear media. Like I don't work in sequences and stuff like that anymore, because in the end the game is non-linear, and everything can happen in any given moment. So I prefer to use the game software and the game tools as my workspace, basically, to create sounds like you would if you worked in Pro Tools in sequences, but instead of importing them in a sequencer, I just import them directly to the game, and then I start to put them together. Yeah.
The electroacoustic music is a very specialized area of contemporary music practice, with a very tiny audience compared to many other musical genres. Do you think it found its home, if you like, in games and sound design for film?
No, not really. I think it should exist on its own. That's where the whole thought of acousmatic and electroacoustic music belongs in a way. But I don't see why you shouldn't kind of use the same strategies and kind of develop them in new directions in combination with the image. But you can say that, of course, maybe games have a much broader audience, So in that way, you kind of draw attention to electroacoustic music. Suddenly, there's a lot of people who didn't know what electroacoustic music was. They discover it and start to kind of investigate what's there.
When you collaborate with your colleagues on designing a game, is sound taken into consideration from the beginning, already at the script level, when you think about scenarios? I saw you showed yesterday an example where this character, this little boy, was literally blown away by sound. That must have been in the script, if you like, as a possible scenario.
Yeah, but that's the nice thing is that we don't really work with scripts. Like it's more like experimenting with ideas. So that idea I showed yesterday was an experiment that I did together with the game designer, and then it kind of builds from there. But I would say, like in general, sound is like in film is added later in the production, which is a shame, of course. But the company where I work, we kind of take it into consideration from the very beginning. But I think also it's something that sound people have to promote, because it's not something that, even where I am, it's not something I'm asked to do. So if I'm just sitting and waiting for people to ask me to do things, then it's not gonna happen. So it's about your attitude, I think. To really come up with ideas and say, hey, we should try this. So I think it's very much a question of attitude, actually.
Showing more self-confidence.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And of course I had Limbo to kind of prove what sound could do, and obviously inside it had a bigger space.
How do you see the relation between feature film, normal linear film storytelling, and game? Can each learn from each other, or can game sound design or game design in general? You can't isolate sound; it's always together with the images. Can you learn from each other or from traditions in film?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think unfortunately in games right now there's this kind of goal to make it sound, this kind of cinematic thing where you try to make it as much look and sound like a movie as possible, but it doesn't always work. But I definitely think that we can learn from each other. I think one thing games can learn from films is to work with dynamics, because most games are really just loud all the time, and I think that's. But of course, it's kind of harder in games because you never know when things happen. So it's really hard to make those kind of builds up. I think in film it's kind of a classical thing that you have before something big sound. You can have 1 minute of silence, and that's kind of hard to organize in a game. I try to do it, but you can only do it like in shorter time spans.
You described yesterday a innovation you introduced, that sound continues even when the game sort of stops, when you can die several times in the game, but the sound world continues somehow and gives you a sense you're still in the place, even you're dead, so to speak.
Yeah.
My question is, are new things developing in games which, in terms of storytelling and creating not these simplistic first-person shooter games or things like that?
Unfortunately, not. I don't think so. I think it's very much mainstream. So it's hard to see those projects, but I think the problem is that it's so expensive to develop games. So it's really hard, you can do any experiments in film, and it can be successful, and it can be interesting visually and sound great and so. But with the games, just just to make a small character, move probably is like months of work. So I think there's a challenge there, and also with the funding. There's almost no, at least in Denmark, there's almost no funding for games. So it's really hard to only get like kind of a commercial shot. If someone trusts that what you do can generate a profit. But then it's not going any new places.
If you compare the soundtrack of a film with the soundtrack of a game, obviously you have to have multiple layers of sound to choose from wherever the player goes. What's the proportion between a linear soundtrack in a film compared to a game soundtrack?
You mean how big it is?
Yeah. For example, is it 10 times the amount of tracks?
I don't actually know, because the games I've done so far are kind of 2D, so you go from left to right, so you can't really go like multiple directions, and in that sense it's not far from film, because I can still kind of design, because you have to hit that button to whatever, and it all happens in the same sequence every time. But obviously, if you create like an open world game, it's just a massive amount of content.
In terms of where do you get your sounds from? Does the real world still plays a part? I mean, I'm thinking of concepts like worldizing, which George Lucas and Walter Murch used.
Yeah, definitely. I go recording as many sounds as I possibly can.
Can you give an example, some exotic example? Unusual locations, times of the year or night, day?
I can't really speak about inside, but for Limbo, I did like when the spider hits the ground. I had a spear, and I went to my son's kindergarten in the middle of the night and banging into the earth, hoping that no one would be watching me. But yes, we are doing a lot of strange things, also recording inside the body and all kind of things.
What was this hotel scene where the little boy in Limbo jumps on the neon display of the hotel? Where did you get that sound from?
Like the more melodic sound?
No, the crackling electric. Maybe I misheard it.
Yeah, I think there was just a lot of electric sound, but also really distorted sounds and metal sounds that I recorded, which is just severely distorted.
You spoke yesterday about that you combine high sophisticated digital technology with the analog world, and sometimes bring back digital sound into the analog. Can you describe
that's
something?
actually related to what you were asking before, was worldizing. I think it's a kind of way of worldizing, because we all know the sound that has been on tape. So it's like if I have something that sounds too digitally, something like that, I often run it through some kind of analog gear, most often tape recorders, because it's like it gets a potential existence in a way. Like I can believe that the sound actually exists, even though that it's a synthesized sound.
How important is spatial diffusion in games? I mean, simple 5.1, and now it's constantly evolving. Now we have Dolby Atmos. That will take some time until it comes to consumer level. How important is that for games?
Depends. I think it's very important, but I don't think we have the answers yet. think there's games, there's kind of a fascination of the idea that the game mixes itself. So you put in the sound sources and then everything just mixes itself, and people are kind of obsessed with kind of creating, representing reality in a way, even though it's not really, because then it becomes all about panning mono sounds around. So if you're standing in a 3D game and turning around, then the sound world does like this, and it's not what happens in real life. It sounds very, in my opinion, it sounds very artificial. But both in Limbo and Inside, I only work with stereo, actually, even though I really like to work in 5.1, but it was just an aesthetic, I could upmix it, and yeah, it sounds great, but after a while I actually preferred the stereo, and I think that relates to the fact that you can only move in one direction, and it's the same challenge that the art people have. You don't want to create an alley, something where you want to go in. You would never have the thought about wanting to go in the other direction, and I think it's the same with the sound. You don't want to have any attention to something behind you, because you can't go there. So it's all about the playing here, and then of course I've been working very much with stereophony and making like a broad image and this anti-phase and all those things. So I'm very detailed about the spatialization, but it's not something that I let the game automate. It's something that's actually quite handcrafted, and we have to hack our way through the tech in order to do like a really plain stereo mix.
Do you still follow what is going on in contemporary music as a source of inspiration?
Not as much as I would like to, but I have an idea that I'm going to now, when I'm finishing this Inside, just to check out what's going on, going to a festival or a conference, and just to see what's...
What kind of music are you thinking of?
Acousmatic music, primarily, yeah.
Where? What certain styles or countries or?
Actually, the UK, and still I think it's very interesting in France. It's probably places I'll go looking.
Some names?
Of course, my old professor, I went to study with him because I really love his music, Dennis Smalley. And also some of my fellow students from back then, to hear how the thing is developed.
Yeah. Developing a fine musical sensibility is, I think, still extremely useful for anything to do with sound.
What do you mean?
Developing a very fine sensitivity for musical structure and the way we listen as musicians is extremely valuable.
Yeah, definitely, in all kind of context, because like working with the image, it kind of changes what you see, basically, and the tangibility of the experience.
That's it.